Welcome to Brite Divinity School's Borderlands Institute Fall Webinar Series entitled Changing the Narrative, Changing Power, Framing Immigration Narratives. My name is Francisco Losada, and I am the director of the Borderlands Institute at Brite Divinity School. It gives me great pleasure today to have with us Dylan Corbett, executive director of the Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas. Before I introduce him, allow me to thank Rowena Tart, the Institute's administrative assistant, who helps tremendously in many different ways to put this event together. Also, I want to thank the Luce Foundation for their steadfast support of the Institute and its initiatives. One more announcement. Please join us for the next event, October 20th, when we will host Dr. Daisy Vargas, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Arizona. The title of her presentation will be, And Some, I Assume, Are Good People, Latinx Religion, Respectability, and the Law in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. Registration is currently available. Now, for those who were with us last fall, the webinar series aimed to bring awareness to the very complex issues around Borderlands with an eye toward the southern border of the U.S. Last year, we focused on various social factors that pertain to the unique political, social, and religious issues that impact the lives of people on the move. Building on the sharp and insightful remarks from our last year's speakers, whose recordings can be found on Brite's YouTube page, this year the Institute turned its attention upon how these factors are rooted in stories, narratives. We began this fall with Natalia Banulescu-Bogdan of the Migration Policy Institute, who led us in a discussion on how we talk about migration, which can also be found on Brite's YouTube page. And now today, we zero in on the southern borderlands with Dylan Corbett, who can speak to the recent arrivals of migrants from various global locations. For those who are engaged with sacred texts, it is well known that stories are laden with meaning, ethics, and point of view to persuade you to believe and do. Narratives convey values, construct representations, and communicate positive and negative assumptions and identities about people on the move, all of which influence our transformative social justice thinking and behaviors. Narratives tell us who we are and who we are not. Narratives challenge us to make change or perhaps no change at all. To continue getting us to think about this broad assertion, as mentioned, we invited Dylan Corbett, the founding executive director of the Hope Border Institute, who has nearly 15 years of experience working on issues of international and human development globally in Washington, D.C., and in the Borderlands. He also coordinates the work of the Vatican's Migrants and Refugee section in Mexico, Central America, and French and Spanish Caribbean. Dylan formerly worked as a staffer to the Bishops of the United States at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development, as well as with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, that is the National Anti-Poverty and Social Justice Program of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He has studied at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and now lives in El Paso, Texas, with his wife and 2 children. Dylan and the Hope Border Institute is not new to Brite. Through the Borderlands Institute Travel Seminar, Brite students, along with Dr. Iracema Coronado at the Arizona State University, have visited the Institute and learned much about what Dylan and the Institute do to introduce, contest, and change the narrative about the flow of migrants. Today's presentation is entitled Displacing and Generative Narratives at the U.S.-Mexico Border. Join me in welcoming Dylan Corbett to our virtual Brite Divinity School. Without further ado, the stage is now yours, Dylan.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Dr. Losado, and to your team, to Brite University, and also to the Luz Foundation for making today's session possible. It's really an honor to be with all of you again and to speak about these issues. I speak, as Dr. Losado said, from the perspective of the work that we do at the Hope Border Institute, which is research on issues impacting the U.S.-Mexico border, especially issues of immigration. And we also run a humanitarian program in Ciudad Juarez in support of migrants and refugees who are impacted by U.S. policy and forced to remain in Mexico. And in the last couple of years, as you know, that population has been significant and has been growing. I can speak perhaps in the Q&A a little bit more to the realities of the populations who are arriving, what the demographic looks like, what the impact of the most recent and contemporary policies are. I'll touch on some of that in my presentation. But what I'd really like to do is focus on, as Dr. Lozado said, the power of narrative. The power of narrative both to enable injustice, as it has for decades and centuries here in the U.S.-Mexico border, and then the power of narrative to help us to shape our imaginations to think about a more just world, and the power of narrative to help us enact a world that is more open to human fraternity and communion. So let me begin there. And to do that, I want to take a bit of a dive into history to speak about how narrative have shaped the history of this border community, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. El Paso's in West Texas. We're on the U.S.-Mexico border, and our sister city is Ciudad Juarez, just across the border from us. If you were to look at us from the sky or on Google Maps, you'd have trouble discerning where one community ended and one community begins. We're separated by a wall, but historically, socially, in terms of faith, and in many ways, our families are connected, our communities are united despite everything that separates us. So let me speak a little bit about the history and how narrative has helped to shape that history. And I think the best way to do that is to speak about it in terms of a triple colonization. We're all familiar with the reality of colonization, which is really a social project in service of economic ambition, in service of political ambition, often both. And that's a reality that's very much shaped the borderlands. If you were to come to El Paso, the first thing that you would see on exiting the airport would be this very large and imposing statue. And this statue represents one layer of this triple colonization. This is Don Juan de Oñate. The statue, at the base of the statue, there are the words El Conquistador, the conqueror. And it's very much representative of this first layer of colonization. In 1598, Don Juan de Oñate crosses the U.S.-Mexico border at a time when this region, and the region extending to California, to Nevada, to Utah, to Arizona, to New Mexico, to Texas, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, all belonged to what was part of the Kingdom of Spain. And when Don Juan de Oñate crosses the border, traveling up the spinal cord of Mexico, up the Sierra, traveling upward from Zacatecas, he crosses the border around El Paso in 1598. He claims all of the territory north of the river, which is the Rio Grande, which is now our southern border as the United States with Mexico, for the crown, for the Spanish crown, an act of colonization. And with this colonization, of course, again, colonization being a project in service of ambition, political and economic, it's subtended with a certain degree, as we know, of racism, of subordination of the local populations. This area, we're in the Chihuahua Desert, was populated by a great family of peoples, indigenous peoples known as the Mogollon family. And it's interesting because all these people were people on the move. They were people who traversed the desert, who would have gone across what is now the border, across the river, back and forth in search of food, constantly moving, a people in movement. And when he crosses the river, he meets some representatives of the different communities here. And the story is told. What he does is, as he crosses the river, it really begins what becomes the construction of the Camino Real, which is the great political and economic highway that connects Mexico City, formerly Tenochtitlan, and northern New Mexico, which is around the capital. He founds the capital in New Mexico around what is now today Santa Fe. So he establishes the great Camino Real upon what was already a great indigenous trading area. So this is nothing new. It's just the presence of a different colonial power now, occupying and traversing and enforcing now this Camino Real, this network of trade and politics and economic and political power. He establishes it, and at the moment, though, he crosses the river, he meets with a group of indigenous peoples And the story is told that a meal is shared, a meal of fish from the Rio Grande. Every year, just outside El Paso, in the area where he crossed the river, there's a historical remembrance that takes place of this event. And in addition to the meal, a mass, a Catholic mass, because they were Catholic, was celebrated, una acción de gracias, misa de acción de gracias, which you might translate as Thanksgiving Mass. So it sounds very familiar to what we would, the Thanksgiving that comes out of the Eastern Seaboard in the American tradition of a meal with indigenous communities. But this, of course, took place decades prior to the arrival of Northern Europeans to the Massachusetts, what would become the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and so forth. So arrival sort of to the narrative of a history of the United States that begins eastward and moves to the west. In reality, there was already a Thanksgiving type narrative that was created with the arrival of the Spanish in the southern part of the United States today. So rival narratives, and which one is told, of course, is instructive. What are the narratives that we tell that are core to our American story? It's interesting that this story is subordinated to that northeastern narrative. Now, that's the sort of the first layer of this triple colonization. If you look at this map, you'll see these are basically lights illuminating the highways in both Mexico and the United States. And what you notice about Mexico is because of its particular geography, the lights, the highways appear to be oriented north and south, más o menos, more or less. And what you notice about the United States is that there's an eastward-westward orientation. So the border, in a sense, in El Paso and Juarez in particular, are at the crux of these two orientations, north and south, east and west. That first history, which is indigenous, which is colonial, which is represented by the Camino Real, meets the history of the United States, which moves from the eastern seaboard to the west, which is part of a march toward west of the United States that has a theology, a narrative that subtends it, manifest destiny, that has a particular, you could say that the westward march in the United States is part of the DNA of American history, moving westward, and Lincoln, his great effort to connect the two seas, the two oceans rather, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, takes place with the construction of the railroad. With the construction and the arrival of the railroad, the United States meets El Paso. And so for us, the railroad is very significant. Just as that statue of Don Juan de Oñate represents that first layer of colonization, for us, the railroad represents that second layer of colonization. It's the point of intersection. So El Paso is at the point of intersection of these two great sweeps, these two great arcs of history. Here you can see a sort of a history of the United States movement, that movement westward. Texas declares its independence in 1836 from Mexico. Not too long later, about a decade later, becomes part of the United States. And the United States incorporates Texas and will ultimately incorporate about what constitutes about half of the territory of all of Mexico by incorporating those western states of California, Nevada, Utah, et cetera, et cetera. And so now you have a different layer of colonization, a second layer of colonization that's also subtended by a certain degree of racism. We know today, social scientists today tell us that the determining factor in Texas declaring its independence from Mexico was in order to preserve the institution of slavery. And so the state, in a sense, is born in a racialized context. And so there's one degree of racism that subtends one type of colonial project, and then another type of racism that subtends another colonial project, the American project, which moves westward. And again, El Paso, Ciudad Juárez find themselves, this community finds itself at the intersection of those two realities, those two arcs of history. And there are consequences to that. And there are consequences to how we think about immigration policy because of that. To give you a sense of how racism subtended and subtends that westward movement, the creation of the state of Texas, the Republic in the state of Texas, and its incorporation into the United States. This is a picture of a lynching of Mexican Americans in Texas around that time of not long after Texas becomes part of the United States. With the coming of the United States into the region, you begin a period of lynching. Most people are familiar with the story of African American lynching in the United States, and rightly so. What many people are not familiar with is how brutal that coming together of those two arcs of history was in this region. And the systematic lynching, the systematic oppression, the systematic political and economic exclusion of Mexican Americans, of Mexicans, of indigenous communities, and of African Americans in the region. It was quite brutal. It's a story that's only beginning to be told in reality. Research into how brutal and the depth of these atrocities is still being conducted. But it's a story of exclusion. It's a story of political exclusion, economic exclusion, of subordination of one population in the service of another political and economic project. So again, a second layer of colonization. It's at this time too that remember that the railroad was largely constructed by the Chinese. So it's at this time too, in the middle of the 19th century, that you get the first anti-immigrant laws in the United States, which are directed at the Chinese. And so there's an invitation to the Chinese to come in to provide labor to build the railroad, which constructs that westward, which enables that westward movement of the United States to the Pacific. But then there's a reaction against, a xenophobic reaction against that community, the Chinese community. And so you have the anti-Asian, the different exclusion acts of the 19th century, which are directed towards the Asians. And in El Paso, the railroad was constructed by the Chinese as well as the Irish. Another example of how immigration policy is inflected with that historical racism. 1924, the 1924 Immigration Act is the first time that we explicitly include racial categories into our immigration laws. This is a time of overt, not covert, not subtle, but overt and explicit racism, especially against Asian populations, as well as against Southern European populations. And it's recognized in the press. It's recognized publicly. This is overt. And so racial quotas are included in the immigration laws to limit immigration, especially from those areas of the world, Southern Europe and Asia. But Mexico is excluded. Mexico is exempted from the racial quotas in this Immigration Act, and there's a reason for that. The U.S.-Mexico border was and continues to be a place of agriculture. So there's a lot of immigrant labor that's used in Texas and other parts of the border. In the agricultural industry. Here in El Paso, for example, we have tomatillo and cotton, the chiles, the green chiles from Hatch, for example, that are famous throughout the country. Lots of immigrant farm labor. And the lobby from the agricultural industry is very strong because the industry, of course, is interested in maintaining that labor. But there's a compromise that's effectuated. And what's that compromise? Well, in the same year that this Immigration Act is passed, in 1924, you have the institution of the Border Patrol, the U.S. Border Patrol, and its capital is here. Its headquarters is here in El Paso, Texas. And so just as Texas was born in a racialized context, the state was born in a racialized context. And some of its instruments, like the Texas Rangers, which were founded in order to patrol and protect the interests of the white Americans who came into Texas around the time of Texas's incorporation into the United States. Another significant institution is born in a racialized context, the Border Patrol. And again, it's that history that frames how immigration as policy is understood here at the border. It's not simply a technocratic question. It's not simply a political question, but it's understood, it's interpreted in a completely different register because there are narratives, racial narratives, which subtend these institutions, which are clearly at the service of particular social and economic and political projects. Another thing, from the incorporation of the state of Texas onward, from the middle of the 19th century onward, you begin to hear over and over in political commentary, in the words of politicians, these tropes about the need to patrol the southern border in order to protect the country from an invasion. And so there's a certain othering that takes place. The word invasion is used over and over as to suggest that the southern border is a place of danger, that beyond the border, there's something to be afraid of, that we're going to be invaded, that there's an existential danger to our country. This is something that's not new. It's been repeated over and over in our history. This photo is from the deployment in 1916 of soldiers from New York State to the border. This was at the time of the Mexican Revolution. And it was also coincident with the time of the First World War. Essentially, the southern border was turned into a staging ground for troops, a practice ground. The border was militarized, and it was turned into a proving ground for troops that would be sent to the front in the First World War. But the U.S.-Mexico border was the sort of the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border that takes place and that begins at this time is enabled by a narrative of invasion, of viewing the southern Mexico border as a place of danger. This is at the same time, this is around the same time, the time of the Mexican Revolution. This is a photo of that's taken from the army base here in El Paso, where immigrants fleeing the conflict in Mexico during the time of the Mexican Revolution were put into detention camps. This is a barbed wire. We know in some cases these barbed wires were electrified. And so the militarization of the border that takes place at this time and the viewing of immigrants as other that enables a certain criminalization of refugees. These are refugees from fleeing the Mexican conflict. It's, again, something that recurs over and over in our history. And it's subtended, again, by racism. It's subtended by narratives which enable that. Let me turn now to the third wave. So we've spoken about the first wave of colonization with the coming of the Spanish, the second wave of colonization with the coming of the United States, and now the third wave with the coming of NAFTA. And so NAFTA transforms the border region into a place of economic trade. What NAFTA does, that economic union between the United States, Mexico, and Canada in the 90s, is create a common trading zone which demolishes borders. And so now with NAFTA, goods, services, financial transactions, et cetera, capital can flow freely across borders with very little controls. But in order to sustain that economic arrangement, which is an economic arrangement predicated on cheap labor in Mexico must remain in Mexico. And so you have the construction of the wall. And this is in the 90s. This is also at a time in the United States, if you recall, when we began to militarize communities throughout the country in response to what was perceived as a wave of crime. And it was a militarized response generated by fear, generated by a narrative of fear. But the reality is that the wall is central to a broader political, social, economic project, which is one, again, in the interest of an economic project, in this case, NAFTA, the generation of profit for multinational corporations. It requires immigration controls. And so in a sense, again, immigration policy at the border is interpreted on a very different register, a visceral register. It's understood that this is not about security. This is not about primarily national security or maintaining the safety and integrity of the United States, but rather this is in furtherance of an economic and political project and a profit. And border communities, we know this in our bones. This is not, it's again interpreted on a very different register because of the history. Now let me take a step back for a moment and speak about immigration broadly. This is a map which indicates the number of international migrants and where they're going. And what you see, broadly speaking, is migrants going from the so-called underdeveloped world to from the developing world, rather, to the developed world. And you see a great number going to the United States. Since we started counting around the time of the Second World War, which again was a time of great displacement, since we started counting, the numbers of migrants throughout the world have never been higher. And that's true of both what we would call regular migration and irregular migration. migration is a fact of life throughout the world now. It's part of our DNA as a world community. There are about 281 million people on the move today for many reasons, in search of jobs, in search of, because people are studying, for example. If we counted up all the people who are on the move, it would be probably the world's third largest country in the world. Now, if we change focus and look at vulnerable people on the move, people who are experiencing forced migration, that population is much smaller, but it's still significant. There are about 100 million refugees in the world today, which is a significant number. Again, the highest number since we started counting. And if you added up all of those people in the world, they would be about the 21st largest country in the world. It's about 1 in 7 persons, if you include all displaced populations, including internally displaced populations. This gives you a sense since 2012 of the growing population of people impacted by forced migration throughout the world. It hit 100 million, as I said, this year in 22, largely because the significant jump here is accounted for largely because from 2021 to 2022 of the Ukrainian conflict. But you also see in red the Venezuelan conflict. In dark blue, light blue, and black, you see refugees and asylum seekers. And then that green figure, something most people don't consider when we think about migration, is internally displaced populations. So, for example, people fleeing violence in one part of Guatemala and going to another part. People who can no longer grow because of climate change in Guatemala, going from the countryside to the capital. Or people fleeing religious persecution in one part of Iraq and going into another part. Internally displaced peoples actually represent the largest amount of forced migration. And it's largely caused, the numbers bear this out today, that the majority of internal displacement is caused actually by climate change. And it's fast becoming one of the most significant drivers of migration overall. Now, we also know that migration, the reasons people are forced to migrate are largely systemic, are largely systematic and driven by inequality. And we have to take this into account. Still today, 19% of the world lives on what less than $1 a day. Since the beginning of the pandemic, which has exacerbated worldwide inequality, including in this region, 9.4% of the workforce in Latin America has been lost, of the female workforce. 252 men today have more wealth than 1 billion women and children in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean combined. 20 of the richest multimillionaires on average emit 8,000 times more carbon than the poorest billion persons on the planet. Another statistic about inequality, the 3 most wealthy people in the world have more resources than the poorest 48 nations combined. And we know, even when we look at immigration, when migrants immigrate from one country to another, that burden sharing is greater in the third world, what we call the third world. So it's largely global inequality, interconnected with climate change. As I said, even in those carbon statistics, there are relations with inequality that is driving worldwide migration. And you can put it like this: if capital doesn't go to the people, people will go to the capital. That's what we're seeing in this map here. Now, when we look at the U.S.-Mexico border, and we can get into this more in the Q&A, we also see a significant jump in arrivals over time. This is 2012, about 2012, the beginning of the Obama administration, to currently July 2022, just a couple months ago. And we're also seeing a rise in the amount of people coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. What's notable here is that you see a rise in the population over the last 10 years of children, unaccompanied children, and families coming to the border. Single mothers who are coming with children, or entire family units who are coming to the border. At the border, we're no longer seeing primarily single men coming from Mexico, which is what we would have seen, for example, around the turn of the century with NAFTA, the great migration that was produced by NAFTA. Now we're seeing asylum seekers from Central America that are coming as families and that are coming as unaccompanied children. And they're fleeing a toxic combination, primarily in Central America, in the countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, of violence, of political instability, of the inability of the states to guarantee the human rights of their populations, and things like climate change. And it's something that's only going to grow. We don't have, on a worldwide basis, the architecture to deal with mass displacement, with the realities of forced displacement today. Mucho menos, even less in the United States. We simply haven't gotten our hands around how to deal with this phenomenon. We need new solutions, and we need new narratives. Two examples of new narratives, and then I'll conclude, or how we think about different narratives. One, a narrative of resistance. This is a picture from around the time of 1917 here in El Paso, at the El Paso Juarez border. In 1917, we had a new mayor, progressive, a so-called progressive, who wanted to implement a cleanup campaign in the poorest sections of the city. And he also wanted to implement a campaign to de-louse people crossing the border. And remember, in a place like El Paso and Juarez, people are constantly coming across the border every day to study, to work, to be with family, et cetera, et cetera. And so he wanted to implement a campaign predicated on othering, predicated on seeing Mexicans as the other, as dirty, as a threat. And this is a very sort of dramatic example of that. And they were sprayed down with gasoline and other chemicals as they came across the border. The pretext was public health, similar to what we hear around Title 42 today. The need to suspend asylum law because of public health. And we all know that pretext, public health officials throughout the country have called this out as a nonsense, which it is. There's no reason for something like Title 42, which is the suspension of asylum law at the border. It's done in the name of public health, and it continues to happen. It was implemented under the Trump administration and continues. But very similar echoes to what happened in 1917 with this delousing campaign. There was a young lady, her name was Carmelita Torres, and she used to cross the border every day in order to work as a domestic worker, like many young Mexican women did at that time and continue to do here in El Paso. And she simply refused to get off the bus to be deloused. She stood up for her human dignity, and she generated what are known as the bath riots of 1917, the bathhouse riots of 1917. There were literally hundreds of other women in Juarez who joined her in staging a protest that lasted for several days because they refused to participate in this inhumane, in this dehumanizing practice. And it's an example of resistance that's not often told. Our history in the United States is becoming less monochromatic, and we're telling the stories of African Americans and other communities that have historically been excluded. But the story of Carmelita Torres and how she refused to get off the bus, it's not a story that is known throughout our country, but it's a story of resistance, that generates, that I think can help us in generating new narratives for the border. A second example of a different narrative. Every year, as you might know, along the whole border, but every year here in El Paso and Juarez in particular, in November, around the time of the Day of the Dead, about a month from now, is celebrated a Eucharist, the sacramental celebration, remembrance of the death and resurrection of Jesus and his celebration of the Last Supper with the disciples. That's enacted at this place of physical exclusion at the wall. It's done each year, and it is what is interesting about it, of course, is that it proclaims a universal communion that transcends the things that divide us, and so serves as the basis for a narrative which can be useful in displacing these narratives of exclusion at the very place, the very physical instantiation of these narratives, which is the U.S.-Mexico border, the border wall itself. a narrative of universal communion, a narrative of table sharing, a sacrament of fraternity, a remembrance of Jesus, who in the Christian tradition, remember, was undocumented. Remember the documentation crisis that provokes the movement of the Holy Family during the time of the census. He was illegal. He was literally born out of wedlock. And he was an alien in a real sense. He has an otherworldly origin. So it's the remembrance of this person who is undocumented, illegal, and from another world. And it's a religious practice that opens up a pathway of hope for all those who are excluded from the table, celebrated right at the wall. The Holy Father, the Pope, has also done something similar. He celebrated a Mass shortly after he was elected to mark the movement of the excluded across the Mediterranean. There's so many migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa and the Middle East, who are dying, as people are dying here in the desert right now, who are dying in the Mediterranean Sea. And he celebrated that Mass on an altar constructed from the remnants of one of the capsized ships. And so bringing the reality of the migration experience into the core of the Christian message, which is this universal table sharing, which generates ideas of universal communion and universal fraternity. And I think we need to go further. The experience of migrants themselves, of vulnerable people on the move, I think is core to constructing a new narrative. And this comes from my experience working with migrants and refugees in Ciudad Juarez, particularly in the last couple of years. There are two things that I think are notable, and then I'll end here. One, hope. Anyone who's worked with migrants, anyone who's been involved in migration ministry or services to migrants knows that migrants are people of hope. It may be a Christian hope, it may be a religious hope, it may not be thematically explicit, it may not be religiously explicit, but it's a hope, a deep hope, because those who migrate have to have hope. You migrate in search of something better. People who don't have hope don't migrate, and you can discover that if you go to sending communities. What makes the person who migrates different is that the migrant still has hope, and it's refreshing and it's powerful. The second thing, if you work with migrants that you discern very quickly, if you're attentive, is that migration is the journey from the periphery to the center, in an existential sense. In this sense, and migrants will tell you this: I was nobody. I want to be somebody. I was meeting with Venezuelan migrants, many of the Venezuelans now who are crossing the border and coming into downtown El Paso, passing through the Darien Gap now because they can't get into Mexico by plane. And so they're making these journeys through the Darien Gap. I met a couple that just had a baby literally a couple days after they arrived, a pregnant woman who had passed through the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous places in the world to travel through. People of hope. And they said this, that we were looking to be somebody and to be part of a community. In migration, that migration from the developing to the developed world, in a very real sense, is a migration of hope, a movement of hope that is a movement, a desire that I think that we all can share to be at the center, to move from exclusion to inclusion, from being treated as nobody, from the greatest fear of being nobody, to being somebody and to being part of a community. And in that sense, and I say this to a community of people who are preparing for religious ministry, there's an eschatological dimension to migration. Migrants, in a real sense, are helping to save our salvation. There's something about salvation which is contained in that experience, and we can get into this. But to put it succinctly, we're all in the same boat, headed to the same port. And migration reminds us about that fundamental narrative of human experience that we all share. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you for an excellent presentation as well as informative. I've already gotten some feedback from some people on it. Thanking you for a splendid presentation. Let me begin with some questions and see if then we can open up the Q&A. And for those who are there, if they have any questions, go ahead and send those in. I'm happy that you began with sort of reflecting on our sort of historical narratives from the 16th century, particularly to the present. And it's something that I've been trying to do in the classroom as well in a couple of my courses this semester here. So students who are present will be familiar with some of the push to know your history, to understand the history of migration, to understand the history of colonization in particular, with African Americans, as well as they're soon about to read about Mexican American history as well in the Southwest. One of the things that I've noticed in the narratives in history is this narrative of the other, the vastness. They're about to read a little bit about Turner's sort of thesis on the West, the expansionist thesis as well, the emptiness there as well. And I think that narrative, that historical narrative that is in many ways not highlighted in many of the textbooks and many of the newsreels of history as we have, I think that's important to understand the present. That is, you can't understand the recent arrivals today unless you understand the history of the Southwest in particular, well, the Northeast as well as the Southwest, because many of those folks in the Northeast were coming to the Southwest to colonize. But can you reflect on that, sort of connect it to a little bit, that the importance of understanding something about the military, the economic, the political ambitions that were present throughout the colonial periods are linked to understanding the present today. Is there anything that come to mind with that?
Yeah, I think it's that knowledge of history is indispensable for really understanding immigration policy today. In reality, this is my reflection on working in migration for some years now here on the U.S.-Mexico border. In reality, you cannot understand current immigration policy, which is not at the border enforcement policy in particular, which is not particularly sophisticated. I would love to say it was sophisticated and it was well thought out, but it's actually quite a blunt instrument, and it's very simple. The U.S.-Mexico border policy has simply been this. It's almost as if it were a coin, and the coin is a coin of deterrence. And the coin has two faces. And one face is militarization, and the other is criminalization. So militarization, hardening the border through the deployment of the military, as we saw during the time of the period of the First World War. Even this week, there were recent announcements of additional National Guard being deployed by the Biden administration to the border. So the deployment of the military, the erection of the wall, the mass investment and over the mass investment in agencies like Border Patrol, ICE, and the deployment of technology like drones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The hardening of the border, and then criminalization, treating migrants as if they were threats. So as we saw during the time of Mexican Revolution, when people were put in the army base and detained, it continues today in for-profit detention, in seeing asylum seekers themselves as threats to our country. Think about immigration policy for a minute. In the 20th century, sort of at midpoint of the century, who administered immigration policy in the United States? It was the Department of Agriculture, the Department of the Interior. Why? Because migrants were viewed primarily at the border through the lens of being cogs in our agricultural industry. Think of things like the Bracero program, for example. Many people in El Paso can trace their industry back to people who came in during the time of the Bracero program. And then it shifts at a certain point as you progress in the 20th century to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice handles immigration at the border. INS was an agency and the Border Patrol were agencies of the Department of Justice. So migrants now interpreted as potential criminals. So as we move in the United States to dealing with social problems through the lens of criminality, looking at every migrant not just as a potential cog in the economic machine, but now as a potential criminal threat, extending the pall of criminality over more and more people. And it's in the 90s, at the same time that we were doing this throughout the country, that we passed immigration laws under President Clinton, for example, that began to take the ability of judges to resolve immigration cases away, just like we were doing in other areas of criminal law in the United States, giving more power to Border Patrol. And also, fast forward today to the detaining of asylum seekers at the border. So treating even asylum seekers who have traditionally been a protected category as criminals, as potential criminals. And now, in a post 9/11 world, which agency administers immigration? It's the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security was created to deal with terrorist threats after 9/11. So now, every immigrant that approaches the border is now a potential, again, existential threat to this country, a potential terrorist. And so you can't understand this very unsophisticated immigration policy if you don't understand how it's inflected with racism and how our response has been, what our response has been throughout the decades.
Another thing that sort of popped up in my head when you were presenting was I could not help not to think of history again, linking history to the present. And one of the things that at least my students have been reading a little bit about is the deportation of Native Americans, in many ways in the 18th century, 19th century, but also the deportation of African Americans as well. And then I'm sort of setting them up a little bit to understand the present a little bit. That what current governors have been doing in Texas as well as Florida, they're following the script, the racial script that's already part of U.S. history. And any comments on that, or does that ring I guess a sensibility in terms of understanding the current times on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing redeemable about what the governor of Florida, the governor of Texas, and the governor of Arizona are doing in sending migrants in an uncoordinated way, sometimes in a way that is directly exploitative and is predicated on deception and lies, moving these migrants, people who are very vulnerable, many of them asylum seekers, and moving them to other parts of the country. And yeah, it's evocative of the reverse freedom ride movement, when states are provocative in sending these populations, African Americans, in a very provocative way. It's a script, again, that repeats itself over and over, and there's no excuse for it. It's politically provocative. It's a politics of xenophobia that unfortunately has purchased in our country, and has had purchase many times, but has in recent years, I think, reached new heights, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn to some questions. Let me see. I might just point. I'll give you the first one here. Is at what specific location at the border is the celebration held? This is, I think, in reference to where I think Pope Francis was doing the liturgy there.
So there's been a couple places. On occasion, the Border Patrol has facilitated the celebration directly in the river. It's been interesting. That's not always been possible because it requires some intensive negotiation with border enforcement. And at other times, it's been at the wall, in a place that's right at the base of what's known as Cristo Rey Mountain. So if you come to El Paso, we're right in the middle of, we're at this unique place of convergence between the Rocky Mountains. We're at the southernmost point of the Rocky Mountain Range and the northernmost point of the Sierra in Mexico. We're in the valley between the two. And so it's at the base of a mountain that begins the Sierra in Mexico. And the mountain, it's this one place where there's no wall. And it's the place where three states, the state of New Mexico, Texas, and Chihuahua, Mexico, and two countries, the U.S. and Mexico, come together. So it's right at the base of the mountain at the border wall.
Okay. Let's see. Let's turn to another question. I'll read it. As we see the rise of Christian nationalism and the rhetoric about migrants that others and demeans them and nurtures a fear of migrants as threats, what are some of the most effective counter-narrative or facts that a person could use to help people open their minds and see a different point of view, other than the ones you have mentioned? Likewise, what are some of the most important steps we can take in Texas to help migrants and fight these harmful scripts, narratives, and laws?
Yeah, good question. Maybe I'll answer it in two ways. One, more philosophical, and one more practical. In a philosophical way, I think we have to, or theoretical philosophical way, I think we have to resist the idea of seeing the other as a threat, which is the object, which is the goal of a politics of exclusion, which is the goal of the politics of xenophobia that we've seen rear its head in recent years. And that politics wants to persuade us that the other is a threat to my existence. And I think we have to flip the script in that sense of not seeing the other as threat, but as the other as an invitation to solidarity. It was Martin Luther King who said, that I can never fully be who I am until you are fully who you are called to be. And realizing that our destinies are interconnected and our destinies are linked. And that's something that you experience in ministry to migrants in a very direct and powerful way. And it's something that you see enacted here on the US-Mexico border in hospitality. That gets to the second point. Not seeing the migrant as other, but seeing our existence as bound up with one another. I don't want to change, as we encounter, Dr. Rosado, you and me, or your students, even in this moment of encuentro, of encounter, I don't want to change you, and I don't want to change me, but I want you to be a little different because we know each other now. And I want to be a little bit different because we know each other. And we're better off and we're enriched by that experience. But if we start from that posture of fear and hate, then it's a very different experience. So we have to flip that. In the second way, I think that we need to, and this is, I think, how you translate these religious concepts and ideals into action. They need to be embedded in practice. And that's another thing that I've learned here in El Paso. This is a place that for decades has offered hospitality to people who are crossing the border, seeking protection, seeking not just a better life, but in many instances, bare existence. And the best way, sure, it's important to be politically active. It's important to promote in a vocal way different narratives. But I think the most efficient, or not efficient, but effective way to do it is to make sure that it's embedded in a practice of hospitality. And that's something that we can do throughout the country. Look at what should be our response to the busing of migrants to places like Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. The border is now everywhere. And a culture of hospitality we can now perform everywhere. There's a performative dimension to faith. The table fellowship we need to make real. We need to build a culture of hospitality in acts of welcome. And now that the border is everywhere, and there are people who are in irregular immigration situations, there are people who are on the periphery economically, socially, in every community throughout this country. How can we promote cultures of welcome, of hospitality? It needs to be embedded in practice. I think that'll be the most effective thing we can do in the long run.
Yeah, that's a constant question I get from students these days. They want to make a change, and they're asking how. And I think your reflection on the encuentro, the encounter, is something I push a little bit as well, and getting to know the other, to begin to distance themselves from the fear of the other, which is a challenge right now, given the preponderance of othering that we see in social media today, and with our political leaders, as well as some religious leaders as well. So many actually these days, which leads me to the next question here. Social media has played a key role in regenerating narratives concerning humanitarian issues. What has been the impact of social media on narrative sharing at the border? Has it been a helpful or harmful element of the narrative at the border?
Yeah, I think in my experience, social media accelerates and exacerbates narrative formation and construction. So the impact has been both. I mean, we've had people, in a negative sense, we've had people, mobilized, and I've been directly threatened by people who have mobilized to come to the border armed with automatic weapons, ready to patrol the border and patrol migrants at the border, who've been activated via social media. And so social media can accelerate and exacerbate those trends. On the other hand, if there's been a silver lining to the politics of xenophobia in the last couple of years, I think that we're all more aware of these trends. We're all more aware of this history. We're all more aware of the practice of criminalization and militarization at the border, and how inconsistent it is with our highest ideals as a country. And I've seen that through social media too. So it has its lights and its shadows.
Okay, let's go to one more question, and then we're toward the end of our allotted time today. Let me show it to you, and I want to sort of, I'll just read it. Thank you for talking about hope in the migrant narratives. My question: with the excluded history of racism, as well as the repeated narrative that favors migration when cheap labor is in demand, and that fears migrants when their inflation or economic downturn, how do we in white and Christian spaces motivate compassion to learn the history and advocate policy change?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's the history, and we've seen it here in El Paso. We've seen the Asian exclusion acts after the construction of the railroad, as I talked about. We've seen the backlash after the Bracero program, and now with this contemporary the contemporary flow of migration from Central America, the wall building after NAFTA. We've seen it all, and I think the most important thing, and it may sound symbolic, but I really believe this, is being able to promote that cultura de encuentro. People are not moved. I think it was Arrupe, the head of the Jesuits in the 70s and 80s, who said something like, people are moved to action by the heart, not the head. And if we can give people an experience of communion, of encounter with someone who's different from themselves, that's the way I think that we get to change. It's not so much through the head today. We have to touch the heart.
I sometimes remind my students of looking at, if I'm using the gospel narratives, to just take a look at all the encounters that the gospel of Jesus is having with all the people who are considered outsiders, the threat to the system. If you look at Mark and Luke, you see the same thing. But you can see these encounters throughout, and I try to point in that direction just to give them some hope. Because I think you read this, you hear all this. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
No. All that, after reading this history, I sometimes have to remind myself to give them hope. Look at places where they can energize, and with the bombardment that we get with media and about look at the migrants as a threat. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just that. I mean, Jesus was, as I said before, Jesus was a migrant. He came from the Father, and he's on that journey back to the Father with humanity. And if you look in the Gospels, it's very clear that Jesus stands with the excluded. Whether it's the Samaritan woman. He talks about the Good Samaritan. There's that expression in Spanish, "Dime con quien andas y te diré quién eres." Tell me who you hang out with, and I'll tell you who you are. And Jesus is on the margins. He's with the excluded. And if you want to adopt the perspective of the divine, that's the you have to adopt that perspective of being in solidarity with those who are excluded.
Okay, thank you. We reached the end. I want to thank Dylan for again a wonderful, informative presentation, and continuing this conversation around changing the narrative, changing power. As we conclude, just a friendly reminder to register for the next event in October 20th with Dr. Daisy Vargas, who will speak on the question of religion, respectability, and the law in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Again, muchas gracias, Dylan, for the work you've done here. You've given it really ties into some of the work I'm doing in my classes right now. And so I want to thank you taking the time today to meet with us again in Brite Divinity School. Thank you.
Gracias.
Okay.